The 3,000-page hearings of the congressional investigation of the Reese Committee on investigation of the subversive activities of the tax-exempt foundations. I bought the only available copy in the country, 3,000 pages, from a really good friend of mine, a wonderful American. He had been offered any amount of money for that 20 years ago by one of the minions of the tax-exempt foundations. They did not want that copy to be floating around. The research director for those hearings, his name was Norman Dodd. I knew him. And the conversation that I'm going to discuss right now that he had with the president of the Ford Foundation, Rowan Gaither, was off the record in New York City at Ford Foundation headquarters. And Norman Dodd told me over dinner in Washington, D.C., in a restaurant in Georgetown, Rowan Gaither said to him, Mr. Dodd, you know, basically, we at the foundations, we don't determine the agenda. The agenda has come from directions from the White House. That was Eisenhower at the time, right at the peak of the Cold War. And that agenda, our instructions are to use our tax-exempt status, your money, folks, change America so it can be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union. Now, a lot of you may say, well, that never happened. Well, it's happening right now, folks. It's happening right now as we speak. Foundation-funded non-bloody revolution. Committee Chairman Carol Reese warned fellow congressmen of a diabolical conspiracy that a certain few foundations were financing the socialist and communist overthrow of the United States. After World War I, they tried to get the League of Nations in. And there was tremendous opposition to that. And then you had opposition between then and between World War II. You had Lindbergh and a lot of Americans going before the Congress to keep us from going into the UN. You had all sorts of opposition. But they got their way. The Reese Committee learned that the Rockefeller Foundation and Carnegie Endowment for International Peace were, with tax-exempt dollars, funding leftist propaganda operations aimed at changing America through the brain, not the battlefield. Patriotism, national sovereignty, individual responsibility, and Christian beliefs were belittled, while the concepts of a one-world government, socialism, collectivism, and humanism were deemed essential for peace in the modern age. A clandestine and successful non-bloody revolution had been masterminded by some of America's most powerful and devious men who did not want to be exposed by a congressional investigating committee. The man chosen by Reese to be the committee's research director was Norman Dodd, Yale graduate, intellectual, and New York investment banker. During this writer's frequent visits to Dodd's retirement home in Keene, Virginia, he repeatedly spoke, Dodd, of his conviction that justice demanded that those foundations should be compelled to spend a like amount of dollars to undo the damage they have done to America, end quote. Dodd sent committee questionnaires to numerous foundations, and as a result of one such request, Joseph E. Johnson, president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, invited Dodd to send a committee staffer to Carnegie's headquarters in New York City to examine the minutes of the meetings of the endowment's trustees. Now, this is Carnegie we're talking about, the one I always go after. These minutes had long since been stored away in a warehouse, and obviously Johnson, who was a close friend of former Carnegie president and Soviet spy Alger Hiss, had no idea what was in them. Don't forget, Alger Hiss headed up the UN in San Francisco. He was the head of the whole thing, world government. The minutes reveal that in 1910, the Carnegie trustees asked themselves this question, quote, is there any way known to man more effective than war to so alter the life of an entire people, end quote. This is in the minutes. For a year, the trustees sought an effective, peaceful method to alter the life of an entire people. But ultimately, they concluded that war was the most effective way to change people. Oh, God. World War I. Horrible war. Oh, God. I mean, it made every other war look like nothing. Consequently, the trustees of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace next asked themselves, quote, how do we involve the United States in a war? And they answered, quote, we must control the diplomatic machinery of the United States by first gaining control of the State Department. Now, don't forget, this is 1910. Norm Dodd said that the trustees' minutes reinforced what the Reese Committee had uncovered elsewhere about the Carnegie Endowment, that it had already become a powerful policy-making force inside the State Department. During those early years of the Carnegie Endowment, war clouds were already forming over Europe, and the opportunity for the enactment of their plan was drawing near. History proved that World War I did indeed have an enormous impact on the American people. For the first time in our history, large numbers of wives and mothers had to leave the home to work in war factories, thus effectively eroding women's historic role as the heart of the family. The sanctity of the family itself was placed in jeopardy. Life in America was so thoroughly changed that, according to Norman Dodd, quote, the trustees had the brashness to congratulate themselves on the wisdom and validity of their original decision, end quote. They sent a confidential message to President Wilson, horrible, listen to this, insisting that the war not be ended too quickly. Carnegie trustee Cleveland Dodge, one of Wilson's financial supporters, had direct access to the president, and as did Elihu Root, endowment president from 1910 to 1925. After the war, the Carnegie Endowment trustees reasoned that if they could get control, here we go, of education in the United States, they would be able to prevent a return to the way of life as it had been prior to the war. And they recruited the Rockefeller Foundation to assist in such a monumental task. According to Dodd, quote, they divided the task in parts, giving to the Rockefeller Foundation the responsibility of altering education as it pertains to domestic subjects. That was the Southern Education Board they set up. But Carnegie retained the task of altering our education in foreign affairs and about international relations. That would be UNESCO, UN, all that stuff. The foundations decided that the most effective method of achieving this goal would be to alter American history. So they awarded grants, fellowships, and scholarships to those professors and historians who would rewrite American history and promote one worldism, humanism, and socialism. By the early 30s, the well-laid plans of the foundation trustees had reached fruition, and a Reese Committee staff report concluded, 1, that there had indeed been a non-bloody revolution in America between 1933 and 1936, 2, that a certain few foundations had funded efforts to change the beliefs of the American people through education and propaganda, and 3, that these revolutionary changes had been accepted without resistance. To demonstrate how thoroughly American opinion had been changed according to the plan of the foundations, we cite the following historical example. At the end of World War I, Woodrow Wilson and his shadowy alter ego, Colonel Edward M. House, tried to sell the U.S. Senate and the American people on the idea of the League of Nations. This was, of course, the first concerted international effort towards a one-world government. Wilson and House failed in their mission, but a generation later, after another great war and much re-education via college international relations clubs, international studies, educational grants, and the like, the Senate and the people readily accepted membership in the United Nations. Roosevelt's foreign policy advisor, Alger Hiss, helped write the UN Charter, in which the Soviet Union was given 3 votes in the General Assembly and the United States only 1. And then, before his perjury conviction for lying, that's Hiss, about his Soviet espionage activities, he went on to become president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Chairman Reese expressed justifiable rage when he described what was happening as a diabolical conspiracy. The conspirators had left little to chance. Those congressional investigations of the early 50s into tax-exempt foundations were mandated by the House of Representatives in a resolution stating, quote, the committee is authorized and directed to conduct a full and complete investigation to determine which of such foundations and organizations are using their resources for un-American and subversive activities, for political purposes, propaganda, or attempts to influence legislation. Now, folks, I want to tell you, the 3,000 pages of testimony, Reese Committee hearings, It's at my son's website, americandeception.com. The person I bought the hearings from, the transcript, was offered 20 years ago any amount of money for that 3,000 pages. The foundations wanted it back. It was the only copy left available. And he would not sell it to them. So my friend sold it to me. My friend knew Norman Dodd very well. He sold it to me for $3,000, which is really cheap. All right, a dollar a page. He'd been offered any amount. They said, we'll pay you anything. You name it, anything. We want that copy. So it's now on the web for everybody to read. All right, now we'll continue. The congressional investigations, right? To determine which of such foundations and organizations are using their resources for un-American and subversive activities, for political purposes, propaganda, or attempts to influence legislation. The tax-exempt status granted to foundations by the Congress of the United States is a special and powerful privilege subsidized by the American taxpayer. Therefore, Congress has not only the authority, but also the obligation to investigate how tax-exempt funds are spent. This should be the next investigation. Ron Paul should do this one, after the Federal Reserve. The Ford Foundation, largest of all the foundations, balked when it received a preliminary questionnaire from the Reese Committee. H. Rowan Gaither, president of the multi-billion-dollar foundation, summoned Committee Research Director Dodd to foundation offices in New York City. At the meeting, Gaither asked, Mr. Dodd, we invited you to come here because we thought that perhaps off the record. You see, that's why it's not in the transcript of the hearings, what I'm reading you now. This was off the record in the office in New York City. We invited you here because we thought that perhaps off the record you would be kind enough to tell us why the Congress is interested in the operations of foundations such as ours. Gaither answered his own rhetorical question with a startling admission. Mr. Dodd, all of us here at the policy-making level of the foundation have at one time or another served in the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner of the CIA, or the European Economic Administration, operating under directives from the White House. We operate under those same directives. The substance of the directives under which we operate is that we shall use our grant-making power to so alter life in the United States that we can be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union, end quote. Stunned, Dodd finally replied, quote, why don't you tell the American people what you just told me? And you could save the taxpayers thousands of dollars set aside for this investigation. Gaither responded, Mr. Dodd, we wouldn't think of doing that. In public, of course, Gaither never admitted what he had revealed in private. However, on numerous public occasions, Norman Dodd repeated what Gaither had said and was neither sued by Gaither nor challenged by the Ford Foundation.